In the need to develop a capacity to know what potential enemies are doing, the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. These messages are between ships at sea, they can be between units, military units in the field. We have a very extensive capability of intercepting messages wherever they may be in the airwaves. Now that is necessary and important to the United States as we look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know. At the same time, that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. And no American would have any privacy left, such is the capability to monitor everything. Telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide if this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country. The technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny. And there would be no way to fight back, because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. I don't want to see this country ever go across the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision so that we never cross over that abyss. That's the abyss from which there is no return.
You are being spied on. There's no other way to say it. Your government, the one designed to protect you, is watching and recording everything you do. To be clear, that doesn't mean they're looking at it right now. And as many reports show, they may never actually look at it. But, and this is a big one, if and when they want to, that information is right there at their fingertips, forever.
There comes a time in the history of nations when fear and complacency allow power to accumulate and liberty and privacy to suffer. That time is now.
You might argue and say there's no way they could be watching. But if you've ever used a computer that's connected to the internet, or a smartphone, or even just make a regular phone call to your aunt in Wisconsin, that information is collected, organized, and stored. And you'll never know when it could come back to haunt you.
I think it's a real abuse of power for the NSA and I think the CIA to have as much information on Americans as we do. And I also think the social media, Google was partly created by the CIA, and the others, Facebook, Twitter, are feeding the information into the CIA to profile you. It's almost like the Sting song, you know, every move you make, every click you take goes right into the NSA and to the CIA.
And this isn't some conspiracy theory. You don't need a tinfoil hat to believe this. All of this is based on leaked files and data straight from the National Security Agency, the FBI, and the CIA. Even President Obama admitted these programs existed and that he was fully aware of what they were doing. There are numerous government testimonies that confirm that the NSA is, has been, and will be snooping not only on millions of US citizens, but on people all around the world.
The people being surveilled by the US government, specifically within this country, it's everybody that uses an electronic device. And around the world, the same. So it's basically, my estimate, somewhere around 4 to 5 billion people are being monitored by the US government every day.
It's a problem that goes back decades, as the US government has been in an arms race to keep up with technology, working to perfect its ability to spy on enemies of the state, at home or abroad. And with the explosion of the digital age, agencies like the CIA and the FBI have a host of new tools at their disposal. Tools so sophisticated that agents can now create a complete profile of a suspect from nothing more than their social media accounts. But this technology comes with a heavy price.
I think the focus that this is about telephone records and telephone companies is too narrow. This is about the electronic age. Any electronic medium you're using, your smartphones, Twitter, Google, Facebook, are getting monitored.
While our leaders claim it can only be used to protect Americans from our enemies, it raises the age-old question: who watches the watchers? And who's to say exactly how this astonishing wealth of new information is being collected and used, and by whom? Because as President Obama said in 2016, Americans must choose between privacy and security. We cannot have both.
You can't have 100% security and also then have 100% privacy and zero inconvenience. We're going to have to make some choices as a society.
Even giving the government the benefit of the doubt and taking them at their word that they're simply looking out for our best interests, there are still shocking examples of our civil liberties being violated. These are the very agencies tasked with protecting us, and they're being caught invading our privacy, snooping into our personal lives, and gathering data that has nothing to do with preventing crime. Yet the chiefs of these agencies vigorously defend themselves when they're caught, saying that they have nothing to hide and really aren't even breaking the law. And in many cases, they're correct. Gathering the kinds of data they're collecting on us isn't breaking the law. And that's even more frightening, especially when that data is being used against us.
Where is the outcry of those in the media who were so upset about Watergate? The question is an obvious one, given the FBI text messages. What did Obama know, and when did he know it?
And it's not just everyday average citizens who need to be wary of what kind of information the government is collecting on them. No, the situation becomes even more dangerous when those agencies whose job it is to protect us turn their abilities into spying on not only American citizens, but politicians in Washington.
Our intelligence services, like the FBI and the CIA and others, have been politicized, and politicized by people who, some of them are on the radical left of the political spectrum. Now, this is vitally important that we save these institutions, because there are enemies to the United States that mean us harm, and these are the agencies that are supposed to protect us. The fact that Obama and his like and Hillary politicize these things is sinful and has undermined the safety of every American.
It sounds like a scenario out of a political thriller novel, but in 2016, that's exactly what happened to President Donald Trump. A secret government court was convened, and using information gathered from one of Trump's associates, the FBI began to spy on the president and all those around him for over a year. Trump famously denounced Obama for wiretapping Trump Tower, an accusation that has been mocked by Democrats and the mainstream media.
Through Carter Page, as collateral, you could start the electronic surveillance of anybody Carter Page talked to. So eventually, the Obama administration had a plan to have electronic surveillance over everyone, virtually, that was in the Trump campaign.
President Trump was vindicated in February of 2018 when senior lawmakers on the House Intelligence Committee released a memo that accused the FBI and Justice Department of abusing their authority. And this isn't some outsider report. Leaders at the highest levels of our nation came forward and said men like John Brennan, the director of the CIA under Obama, were intentionally targeting Trump to discredit him as a candidate in the 2016 election.
I think John Brennan has turned out to be such a partisan, such a sort of vituperative critic of the president, and I do really am concerned about having so many people now in the intelligence community that have come out with real partisan views while they're at work. I mean, when people are plotting at work to try to prevent President Trump from being president, that's a problem.
Another problem is that our politicians aren't treating this like it is a problem. When it was revealed in 2013 that the government was essentially violating American civil liberties, our leaders dismissed the news with a wave of the hand, treating Americans like we were idiots to even be concerned about such violations. In fact, when the news of mass surveillance broke, Senator Harry Reid, the Democratic Majority Leader at the time, literally told everyone to just calm down and said that none of this is anything new. Meaning, quite clearly, that he and many others in Washington were well aware our rights were being trampled on, and that not only were they doing nothing about it, but they actually approved of it. There are laws in place to prevent this kind of mass surveillance from being abused, and those laws go all the way back to the mid-1970s, centering on the FISA Court. FISA isn't a term most people are familiar with, and it stands for Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. To understand what that means and why it's important, we need to look back at its creation. FISA was established in the wake of the widespread surveillance violations taking place under the Nixon administration. It was designed to protect American civil liberties and ensure the government didn't overstep its authority. One America's Jack Posobiec is a former military intelligence officer and says the FISA Court was crucial to keeping the government in check.
Signed into law in 1978, the FISA Act requires the government to obtain permission from a judge on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISA Court, in order to surveil communications on domestic soil for national security reasons. The court was set up after the Church Committee, which found numerous programs by the U.S. government to include the U.S. military, was spying on American citizens and American political groups. So the FISA Court makes decisions as to whether or not to approve wiretaps, data collection, and government requests regarding monitoring suspected terrorists and foreign spies.
That last part is key: suspected terrorists and spies. FISA was set up from the very beginning to help protect America from foreign agents, people working against the government to commit acts of treason, espionage, or terrorism. Not everyday, ordinary citizens like you and me. This secretive court was created with the best of intentions, as they usually are, to protect us from the kind of sweeping surveillance the NSA and even the military was carrying out for purely political purposes. Following the creation of the FISA Court, to get this kind of surveillance, a warrant was now required, and it wasn't designed to be easy to get.
For electronic surveillance, the government has to show that the target might be spying for a foreign government organization. Once evidence has been accumulated, the information must then be outlined in an affidavit, and the application stating the grounds for the FISA warrant. In the normal process, the completed FISA application goes through the FBI chain of command before making its way to FBI headquarters to receive approval and sign-off by the special agent in charge of the field office, before making it to the Justice Department, where attorneys from the National Security Division vet the application to verify all the assertions that are made in it. The FISA Court then reviews the application in secret and decides whether to approve the warrant. However, there may be something called incidental collection of U.S. citizens' private data, or conversations, if they're in the company of a suspected foreign person being surveilled under FISA. So some argue this constitutes backdoor surveillance by the U.S. government.
So Frank Church and his committee take on the NSA and investigate literally hundreds of cases of warrantless wiretappings and unauthorized surveillance. They put the NSA on the run, and for over a decade, America's top spy agency was afraid to step out of line. The committee was a success, and the idea of using the NSA to abuse surveillance was largely kept out of bounds. That all changed in 1992 when President Bill Clinton took office, and the line the NSA was afraid to cross started to get a little blurred. As technology advanced by leaps and bounds, the NSA was pushing for a way to keep an eye on potential threats. One solution to this came from AT&T, which offered to sell a telephone featuring military-grade encryption for businesses. The problem was that violated global export restrictions, and there was nothing to stop criminals from getting their hands on the phone. In the final months of the first Bush administration, the NSA offered up a solution: use the Clipper chip. Basically, as the internet began to take shape in the early 90s, technology companies were finding new and inventive ways to encrypt their data to protect their privacy. That didn't sit well with the government, and so the NSA stepped in with a bold plan to build a backdoor that could let them listen in on any conversation they wanted. The White House was on board, and when the NSA proposed the Clipper chip, the Clinton administration was only too eager to give it the green light. This raised alarm bells for a lot of people who said their privacy was being violated. But that didn't stop the new administration, and ignoring these concerns, the NSA rolled out the program in 1994. At first, it looked like it would be a success, with the NSA able to listen into calls at any point in the connection, anywhere in the country.
If you collect all the information about everyone, it is easy to see what people are doing at any given moment in time. You pick the people you want to track, and you see what they do. Then you contrive a story that is old gumshoe investigative work that the FBI normally would do in past days to fit the data you saw surreptitiously.
Law enforcement could suddenly eavesdrop on criminals as long as they were using the AT&T phone. But unfortunately for the NSA, that success was short-lived. The chip was both expensive and used a lot of power, and at the same time, a bunch of other open-ended encryption tools were also hitting the market. The Clipper chip became obsolete overnight. But that wasn't the end of Big Brother's efforts to get a peek into our private lives. Not to be thwarted, the NSA began research into projects using sophisticated techniques to wiretap and collect data on Americans in ways they had never been able to before. At the same time the Clipper chip was in development, the NSA was also working on new cutting-edge tools to spy on the expanding world of the internet. This untapped digital frontier presented a wealth of new opportunities for the government to get a glimpse into the private lives of American citizens. Leading the effort was a crack mathematician and 30-year NSA veteran, William Binney. However, unlike many of his colleagues at the NSA, Binney was convinced the agency needed to do more to protect Americans' privacy. His software, codenamed ThinThread, was designed to analyze the massive amounts of new data, but also keep that data anonymous.
ThinThread program we started that in 1993, 94, somewhere in there, to try to be able to pull in data from the digital networks of the world that were expanding all over the place. But the whole objective was to be able to look into massive amounts of data on the order of 10 terabytes a minute and see what was important in there and smartly select that data out, and only that data, so that we didn't burden our analysts with too much information, which was what was happening even back in the 90s. So that was the objective, to get that down to the relevant information that would give it to our analysts so that they would have it and could actually succeed at what they're trying to do.
The program was built to comb through millions of terabytes of metadata, sifting out the useful information like emails and geolocation, and ignoring all the rest. It was also intended to follow the law and carefully encrypted the sensitive information of innocent American citizens whose details just happened to get caught up in the collection. The new treasure trove of data was in the form of phone calls and emails, and the system wouldn't ring any bells until it had actually identified a suspect. The project underwent serious testing, and by 1998 could pick up threats with incredible accuracy.
With ThinThread, we only pulled in relevant information for the targets for our analysts to look at. That way they had a rich environment to actually do their job and succeed at it.
It was far more effective than what the NSA was already using at the time, and also had built-in tools to make sure it was being used efficiently and to prevent agents from abusing it to spy on US citizens. Binney explains that it was also extremely cheap. It cost just $3.2 million to build from scratch and was fully automated, meaning that no one needed to maintain it. Though ThinThread remained relatively obscure during Clinton's time in office, by the time President George W. Bush was elected, officials decided to give it another look. Yet the director of the NSA at the time, four-star General Michael Hayden, just wasn't a fan of the software. Despite all its promising features, Hayden wanted to go for a more aggressive approach to national security and didn't like all of ThinThread's built-in privacy controls. In a top-secret meeting with President Bush, Hayden argued for a program that would gather the data from phone calls and emails of hundreds of millions of Americans and then analyze them for potential threats. In an interview, Hayden says that he told Bush he was worried about whether or not the program was legal, and says that Bush responded with the shocking reply, "Don't worry about the legality, just make it happen." With the president's blessing, Hayden went with a newly proposed project called Trailblazer, which had never been tested before and was still just a concept on paper at that point. But that didn't matter. In a fight between the two programs, Thin Thread never had a chance.
Well, it started a slow decline once Hayden really went against it in April of 2000. It started down. At that point, people started opposing it. And in August of 2001, Maureen Baginski canceled it.
Executives at the NSA, including the third highest officer at the agency, Maureen Baginski, decided the less efficient and astonishingly more expensive Trailblazer would be a better choice.
Trailblazer was a program started at NSA by General Hayden when he came in. It was supposed to be his premier program at NSA. And the objective was to deal with the volume, velocity, and variety of the digital age. Something that we had already solved under Thin Thread, but he wanted to create this program to ask for money downtown, and the original request was for $3.8 billion to manage the 5 years of the first 5 years of the Trailblazer program.
Nearly $4 billion for a less efficient program that was far more intrusive compared to the measly $3.2 million for Thin Thread. It's clear that someone's pockets were being lined for that deal, and it wasn't the American people's. At the end of August 2001, the NSA scrapped Thin Thread and replaced it with Trailblazer. Despite being less efficient, Trailblazer would help bring in a lot more funding for the NSA from Congress. It was as simple as that. But then, just 3 weeks after abandoning Thin Thread, Islamic terrorists flew their planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11. It was a tragedy that shook America's intelligence agencies to their core. Here was something the NSA had been created specifically to prevent, and it completely slipped through the cracks. How could this have happened? Well, according to Binney and many others, Thin Thread would have been able to prevent the attacks on New York. Binney and other analysts have argued that bulk data collection from programs like Trailblazer isn't the solution. That much information simply bogs down the system.
When we collect in bulk all of these records of Americans' phone calls, we're not necessarily being any more effective in protecting the country, and we're sweeping up, we're vacuuming up innocent Americans' phone records. Let's restrict that to terrorists or spies.
Binney and several other key NSA intelligence officials quit the agency in disgust in the weeks following the 9/11 attacks. They all said they couldn't be a part of a program that was blatantly violating American civil liberties. But one man who stayed on afterwards was Thomas Drake, a senior executive at the agency and decorated Air Force and Navy veteran. Drake decided to take the data that the NSA had already collected through the Thin Thread and see if it had any information about the attacks. What he found was startling. Despite the NSA's best efforts, William Binney was right. Drake says he found critical intelligence in the Thin Thread files, revealing an Al-Qaeda network and a ton of other information the NSA never even knew about. And it had just been sitting right there in front of them the whole time.
Relative to what's happening today, the Thin Thread program was kind of actually more advanced than what they're doing today, because we used a focused, targeted approach. That meant that we pulled in only selected relevant data. We didn't pull in everything. Today they take in everything. It's bulk acquisition.
Drake explained there were even details about previously unidentified targets, as well as additional plots that hadn't succeeded. But thanks to the clunky bulk collection systems in place at the NSA, the information had been totally ignored. Not only that, but the NSA was doubling down on its current spy programs, and Drake began getting orders to use foreign surveillance tools on American citizens. What the government was doing was nothing short of weaponizing its spy technology against the American people.
Because even if you're not doing anything wrong, you're being watched and recorded. It's getting to the point you don't have to have done anything wrong. You simply have to eventually fall under suspicion from somebody, even by a wrong call. And then they can use the system to go back in time and scrutinize every decision you've ever made, every friend you've ever discussed something with, and attack you on that basis to sort of derive suspicion from an innocent life and paint anyone in the context of a wrongdoer.
Trailblazer was shut down in 2006, but that wasn't the end of the NSA's efforts to spy on Americans. Nor did it stop the government from trying to silence anyone from raising objections to the program. For their efforts, the homes of Benny, Wiebe, and one other colleague were broken into by FBI agents waving guns at their families. Apparently, Bush didn't want people knowing what he was up to, which is actually incredibly ironic.
But what really bothers me is the massive storage of data without regard for innocence or probable guilt of those being surveilled. That breaks down our whole constitutional system of justice, undermines it right off the bat.
In 2009, a draft from an NSA Inspector General's report reveals that Bush intentionally tried to work around privacy laws in the wake of 9/11, giving the agency the ability to wiretap and monitor Americans without any warrants. National security officials at the time backed this up by accusing President Bush of granting the NSA spying powers far beyond the counterterrorism measures provided by the Patriot Act. That act, what many call the most unpatriotic act in American history, wiped out all the checks and balances that had kept the government from spying on citizens. Before the Patriot Act, the NSA and FBI had to get warrants to gather intel on Americans, but that was complicated and took time and might even be denied by a judge, something the new Bush administration just didn't want to worry about. In 2015, Congress finally decided to rein in the Patriot Act, but only after whistleblower Edward Snowden revealed what was going on. Section 215 of the Act, which continues today, still collects tons of data, like who Americans are calling and when, but doesn't record the content. Fortunately, the NSA now has Section 702 under FISA, and that does record what you're saying.
They're literally collecting every phone record of every American and holding that in a database.
Still, spying on Americans became common practice under President Bush, who expanded the NSA's abilities to a degree never seen before. And a lot of what they do really does go unseen. But we still get glimpses, like in 2006 when an AT&T technician blew the whistle on his company, revealing it was totally on board with the illegal surveillance train. He discovered that AT&T was collecting and making copies of all emails and web browsing data at its facility in San Francisco in a special room called 641A, and was happily passing all of it along to the NSA.
Well, the surveillance programs that they've installed have basically destroyed the Fourth Amendment. In fact, most of the Constitution has been, or at least the Bill of Rights, have been wiped out. Short messages, chat, everything. They're monitoring it all and storing it all.
And all these violations were set in motion by President Bush, who paved the way for everything else to come. Yet despite the shocking precedent set by Bush, nothing could prepare the world for what would happen under President Obama. Obama took domestic spying to the next level, turning the full force of the NSA and the most powerful surveillance tools in the world into a state-of-the-art weapon for taking down his political opponents.
It isn't so much what President Obama has done, although he's done a lot, none very little good. But it's not that what he's done with his usurpations of power as much as it is the precedent that it sets for lawlessness that may follow. If the executive branch can initiate war, if the executive branch can detain citizens without trial, if it can amend legislation, if it can declare to Congress that Congress is in recess, then government, unrestrained by law, becomes nothing short of tyranny.
Obama pushed for more intrusive spying, even calling for Apple to install backdoors in its software to allow the government to record customer data. Under President Obama, electronic wiretaps on phones grew by an alarming 60%. But that's nothing compared to the illegal surveillance on Americans' emails and internet habits, which exploded by 300% from 2013 to 2016. But Obama wasn't content to keep his invasion of our civil liberties limited to the internet. In 2011, he signed the National Defense Authorization Act, which included a charming little provision called Section 1021. That gave him the terrifying ability to use our military to indefinitely lock up American citizens, not foreigners, but natural citizens, without any trial. Just so long as they're suspected of working with terrorists. No proof required. Under Obama, startling new computer programs began assembling complete dossiers on not only Americans, but people all over the world. Programs with sinister names like Stellar Wind, Boundless Informant, and Carnivore, to name a few. And pretty much anyone can view your private data. Leaked information reveals that even low-level NSA analysts are allowed to search and then listen in on Americans' communications. They don't even need a supervisor for approval.
When Obama came in, he looked at that. He talked and I had hoped for him because he was basically a constitutional lawyer and he taught that constitutional law. So I had thought that he might stop some of this. But instead of that, he looked at that and said, this is all this power we really need. And he doubled down on it. So now it expanded. That's why we had the million square foot facility in Utah built. Now they're building another one, a 2.8 million square foot facility on Fort Meade. You know, so the doubling down during Obama was only increased another order of magnitude the spying. So he basically went along with what the Bush-Cheney administration did and improved on it, basically.
That center in Utah was in a town called Bluffdale, where the so-called Utah Data Center was built in May of 2014. The 1.5 million square foot facility cost nearly $4 billion to build, and though its mission is classified, whistleblowers like Kirk Wiebe and Bill Binney have reported that it lets the NSA conduct live surveillance on anyone in the country. Not only that, but it actively collects and stores all digital communications running into and out of the United States. Every message you write, every call you make, every picture you send to anyone is snatched up and stored there forever, all without a warrant.
Obama out.
And although not everyone went along with it, Obama still pushed ahead with his bulk collection programs. Even a veteran and senior FBI official who was supervising the warrantless surveillance program warned then-director James Comey that it was totally ineffective at catching terrorists.
I came in with a healthy skepticism about these programs. My team evaluated them. We scrubbed them thoroughly. We actually expanded some of the oversight, increased some of the safeguards. But my assessment and my team's assessment was that they help us prevent terrorist attacks.
The official reported that after collecting hundreds of thousands of Americans' records for over a decade, the program had only helped disrupt one possible terrorist plot.
It's time to have real reform, not a veneer of reform. You know why? Because we've got to rebuild the American people's trust in our intelligence community so we can be safe, so we can meet the threats that are all over the world. But we don't do that by bulk data collection that violates the privacy of Americans, that's unconstitutional, and is shown to not be effective.
Disrupting a single plot is a big difference from what the NSA originally claimed when they said their spying had helped thwart a whopping 52 terrorist attacks. Retired four-star general and former director of the NSA, Keith Alexander, made the claim that the NSA's programs had thwarted dozens of attacks. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the NSA quietly revised that number down to 11, and then finally admitted they'd only prevented a single case. And according to court records, that one case was detected by other means and wasn't even prevented by surveillance.
In fact, when this came up, the government said, well, we've captured 52 terrorists because of this. But then when the president's own privacy commission looked at all 52 of them, there was a debate about maybe whether one had been aided, but not found by these records and would have been found by other records. We have to decide as a country whether we value our Bill of Rights, whether we value our privacy, or whether we're willing to give that up to feel safer. Because I'm not even sure you really can argue that we are safer, but people will argue that they feel safer.
That takes us to 2013, when the biggest batch of government secrets in the history of America was leaked to the public, and Washington was caught totally unprepared. In early June of that year, former NSA contractor Edward Snowden released thousands of highly classified documents that revealed the massive scope of illegal surveillance being carried out on the American public. Programs at the NSA, in cooperation with the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and governments around the world, were all trained on gathering up vast amounts of data on innocent, unsuspecting civilians. Never before had Americans had an inside look at just how intensely the government was spying on them, and the outcry was immediate.
I think that the public is owed an explanation of the motivations behind the people who make these disclosures that are outside of the democratic model. When you are subverting the power of government, that's a fundamentally dangerous thing to democracy.
Snowden's documents proved our worst fears. The government, after years of perfecting its abilities, and now under Obama's leadership, had its hands tightly wrapped around every aspect of our lives. What first began as a program to combat terrorism was now eavesdropping on our phone calls, text messages, and private social media accounts.
Originally, we saw that focus very narrowly tailored as foreign intelligence gathered overseas. Now, increasingly, we see that it's happening domestically. And to do that, the NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default. It collects them in its system, and it filters them, and it analyzes them, and it measures them, and it stores them for periods of time, simply because that's the easiest, most efficient, and most valuable way to achieve these ends. So while they may be intending to target someone associated with a foreign government or someone that they suspect of terrorism, they're collecting your communications to do so.
For his troubles, Snowden was forced to flee to Russia, where he also applied for asylum in at least 21 other countries. But getting caught with his pants down didn't suit Obama, and under his instruction, Vice President Joe Biden put huge pressure on governments around the world, demanding that they refuse to grant Snowden any asylum. It didn't matter though, the damage was done. The information was out in the open, and there was nothing the government could do to prevent the public from knowing just how bad things really were. Democrats and Republicans alike rushed to reassure their constituents, and some even blamed them for worrying, saying that only people with something to hide needed to worry. But for most people, that was a pretty weak excuse.
Once upon a time, we had a standard in our country that was innocent until proven guilty. We've given up on so much. Now people are talking about a standard that is, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Think about it. Is that the standard we're willing to live under?
Fast forward a couple of years, and we get up to 2016, election year. Obama's 8 long years of surveillance abuses are coming to an end, and with Hillary Clinton having rigged the primaries against Bernie Sanders, the stage is set for Big Brother's next big act. But there's one problem. Voters just aren't going for Hillary. In the wake of an embarrassing email scandal and an active FBI investigation into her allegedly illegal handling of classified material, Americans aren't looking to elect another corrupt dynasty candidate. They wanted an outsider. They wanted Donald Trump. But Trump was the antithesis of everything Obama and Hillary's America stood for, and so there was just one thing left to do. It was time to crank up the surveillance. Digging up dirt on Trump was supposed to be easy, but as the Democrats and Hillary dug, they weren't finding anything they could use to discredit the surprisingly successful outsider candidate. That's when Hillary's team had the idea of paying for some opposition research. Hillary said jump, and the DNC hired Perkins Coie, who hired Fusion GPS, who hired Christopher Steele. Having teamed up with the FBI in the past and being a former British intelligence officer, Steele was an obvious choice to do the dirty work. Steele dug, put together his findings, and handed them over to the FBI in what's now known as the infamous dossier. The document was neatly packaged, and the FBI used it to authorize a secret FISA warrant against one of Trump's associates, with the suspicion that Trump was secretly colluding with the Russians to throw the election. It all looked like a home run for Hillary, but there were some serious problems. The dossier was basically a collection of memos written over several months, but it had the unfortunate quality of being totally unverified. Ranging from gratuitous sex acts to contact with Russian operatives, not only was most of the dossier unverified, but in many cases, there was also no way to verify it. After more than a year of intense scrutiny, the only parts of the dossier that have been verified are generic facts and locations. In fact, New York Times reporter Matthew Rosenberg said that after reviewing the dossier that barely 30% of it was accurate, and most of that was totally unrelated to President Trump. Despite this, the dossier does actually reveal at least one clear case of collusion. Yet it's not between Trump and Russia, however, but between Hillary Clinton, the DNC, and the FBI, all to prevent Trump from getting elected.
I would describe the alleged Russian hack of the DNC emails as a total fabrication. It's been a lie from the beginning, and it was fabricated, and they tried to prevent, over time, they tried to present information that they thought would justify their statements.
Democrats doubled down on one of Trump's campaign advisors, Carter Page, who never actually met or spoke to Trump, and tried to paint him as a Russian spy. Ranking Democrats like Adam Schiff claimed that Christopher Steele's report is evidence beyond a shadow of a doubt that Trump was colluding with Russia. But here's the problem. The only thing the dossier is evidence of is something called parallel construction.
Parallel construction is that they look through the database, they find out information on someone, they know it can't be used in court, they know it was gathered illegally, and then they go and try to get information they can use in court by parallel construction. They try to investigate a person. The problem with this is that, do we want to live in a society where the government can listen to all of your phone calls and then begin investigating you based on private phone calls? The information on that phone call was gathered without a warrant and illegally.
To boil it down, parallel construction is the official practice of the unofficial tactic to use warrantless surveillance to obtain a warrant. So you illegally spy on someone, find the evidence you need, and then make it look like you stumbled on the evidence while doing something else, and get a judge to give you a warrant. And that's exactly what the FBI did when it chose Carter Page to take down Trump.
The monitoring of the Trump campaign, or Trump as a candidate, or anything dealing with him or anybody associated with his campaign certainly was available in the bulk acquisition. It was stored. If anybody wanted to get it, they could go get it. And the probability of him have that happening is probably one, that it absolutely did happen. Once he announced his intent to run for president. Once that occurred, I think he automatically became top of the heap to be monitored.
Page was an advisor at the furthest edges of the Trump campaign, who also happened to do a lot of business in Russia. He was the perfect candidate to pin the story of a Moscow connection on, especially as Trump loudly called for better relations with Russia in his campaign. But it turns out the FBI really just appears to have been using Steele to launder its own intelligence information. We know this because rather than Steele writing his own dossier, then giving it to the FBI actually fed Steele information gathered from its spy programs, which Steele then used in his report. The proof is in a small, easily overlooked detail. In fact, it's just one name: Michael Cohen. In the FBI's FISA search, they found that Michael Cohen, a longtime lawyer for Trump, was traveling to Prague. This information was included in Steele's dossier. The trouble is that it was the wrong Michael Cohen. The Michael Cohen flagged in the report wasn't Trump's lawyer, and there's absolutely no way Steele could have found this random Michael Cohen without access to the FISA search info, which he couldn't have gotten without help from the FBI, which creates a trail from Steele leading right to the FISA database.
The FBI had an ongoing coup d'etat plan against President Trump that was designed to remove him from office. And part of that plan was using this Fusion GPS dossier as evidence that the FISA court should grant this electronic surveillance. And it does not appear that the FBI told the FISA court that the FBI could not validate or authenticate the claims in the FISA document, which would suggest that some criminal activity had occurred in misrepresenting that document to the FISA court.
Essentially, the FBI used the FISA court to obtain a warrant to investigate Carter Page to go after Trump. But the warrant was based on faulty information from an informant who was clearly biased and was paid for by Hillary Clinton in an effort to discredit her opponent in an election.
Well, it's very scary, right? The federal government's not supposed to be able to spy on American citizens without a very, very good reason. And that's why there's supposed to be this protection with the FISA court and a very rigorous process for getting a warrant.
All of this was known by the FBI, and they went ahead and presented the warrant to the FISA court without revealing any of it to the FISA judges.
We have evidence that Christopher Steele paid Russian agents, and he was paid for by Hillary Clinton. So the only direct linkage we have to Russians so far in the evidence is actually the Hillary Clinton campaign through Christopher Steele to Russian agents that were paid for this dossier.
So to be clear, Hillary's team paid for a foreign agent to dig up dirt on Trump to prove that Trump was using a foreign agent to dig up dirt on Hillary. And not only was Trump targeted through Carter Page, but under Obama's corrupt Department of Justice, other members of Trump's campaign were singled out as well.
One of the most well-known instances of this backdoor collection concerns a phone call between General Michael Flynn, then on the Trump transition team, as the incoming national security advisor. So Flynn spoke to the Russian ambassador at the time, Sergei Kislyak. A full transcript of their conversation was obtained by U.S. intelligence services, and General Flynn's name was later leaked and unmasked by Susan Rice, the national security advisor under Obama. Flynn's name was leaked to newspapers, and he was eventually charged by special counsel Robert Mueller for this completely legal conversation. The real question is, how did the U.S. government have a copy of the conversation to begin with? Backdoor, incidental collection obtained through a wiretap. President Trump now has made some moves to clean up this process, but so far, incidental collection is still a major issue with government wiretaps. In fact, it is these wireless wiretaps of U.S. citizens that are exactly why the FISA court was set up in the first place.
Records show that FISA courts usually grant over 90% of the warrants requested by the FBI, meaning that anytime the agency needs to spy on someone, they pretty much know they'll get it approved. And these fears seem justified, with leading members of the House Intelligence Committee releasing a memo that calls into question the FISA court and asks if the FBI abused its power to conspire against Trump.
Unfortunately, it wasn't the Russian government that was doing this. It was the U.S. government, in terms of the hacking, number one, was seen on the, with this illegitimate FISA warrant. And then the fake news and propaganda was this same, false story that was used in September 2016 to start this investigation, to help build upon this investigation against myself and, start something there and really go after the Trump campaign.
And it's not as though the FBI is innocent and unaware or is just an agency trying to do its job. In the spring of 2017, the FBI declared that it was putting a stop to several controversial surveillance techniques after coming under intense pressure from the FISA court. Normally very secretive and tight-lipped about its findings, the FISA court issued a rare statement calling out the FBI for not revealing how it had abused its surveillance powers in the past. The court denounced the FBI for its complete disregard for American civil liberties, violating our rights under the Fourth Amendment.
We had a responsibility, House Republicans, and as chair of the Intelligence Committee, we're the last line of defense. We're the people who have to provide oversight. If we see a FISA court that's not getting all of the information to get a warrant on an American citizen. It's totally unacceptable and it has to be fixed. And the American people deserve to know.
Yet so far, with all of the weight of the Democratic Party, the far left, and the overwhelming media tirade, Carter Page has not been charged or even accused of any crime. What's more, all of this is based on a dossier that the FBI director at the time, James Comey, called both salacious and unverified.
So you can see why the issue of privacy is not a small issue. It is a big issue and was incredibly important to our founding fathers. Some have said it's too late. It's too late to even get this back.
Why is any of this a problem? And what does it have to do with government surveillance? It's a problem because it all stems from the FISA court, something that was created specifically to safeguard Americans from intrusive surveillance. The Church Committee back in the 70s was established to investigate the abuses of the FBI and the Nixon administration. 40 years later, the FBI is at it again, only this time the FISA court is helping them. Or at best, it's not holding them back.
From the Church investigation in the 1970s, I mean, he was worried about our surveillance state and crossing a bridge that took us too far with the sense that in history, down through history, assembling that kind of information in one point gives people a lot of power, and that power, people don't like to give up power. They like to keep it. It's a failing in human nature, I guess. And eventually, though, they use it. And so that's what he was afraid of.
It's easy to turn a blind eye to this kind of intrusion and overreach when you're not a fan of the person they're going after because it's working in your favor. But a tool that's used against your enemies today could just as easily be turned against your candidate tomorrow, or even be used against you. The very FISA court that was supposed to be used against terrorists and spies is instead being used against Trump supporters.
But here's the rub about this. You need checks and balances. As Madison said, men are not angels. And we found out recently there were people in the FBI plotting to bring the president down.
And it's not just a case of the government spying on innocent people and then using that information to arrest criminals. That would be bad, but at least it would be for the right reasons. But this is a case of the government using unimaginably powerful surveillance tools to not only spy on innocent people, but to turn those tools into cutting-edge political weapons, just to prevent a candidate from fairly winning an election.
They were playing games with surveillance from the very beginning, and it's gotten much worse. The fact is now we see that our agencies that we have depended on professionals in the NSA, professionals in the FBI, professionals in the CIA not to use surveillance of American citizens unless it was absolutely justified and agreed upon by a judge. Now we see where that whole process has been compromised for political purposes by the last administration. We need to act on this to make sure we set things straight again. We have to be concerned about our national security, but we cannot permit American citizens to be spied upon by their political opponents simply because their now opponents are in control of the White House.
There are no checks and balances. The head of America's intelligence agency, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI, is a political appointment. He's a cabinet member chosen by the president. For President Obama in 2016, that man was James Clapper. If he wanted to turn the nation's intelligence against a political opponent, there'd be no one to stop him. In the FBI, Obama had close friends in both James Comey and Andrew McCabe. Heading the Department of Justice, he had Loretta Lynch and Sally Yates, and in the CIA, he had John Brennan, and the Department of Defense was Ash Carter. All staunch allies of Obama and reporting to James Clapper, another Obama ally, who, by the way, lied to Congress under oath about spying on Americans. And guess who signed the FISA warrants for Carter Page? You guessed it, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, Sally Yates, and Dana Bente, another Obama appointee. You can't make this stuff up, and sadly, it's all we have to rely on for justice in America.
The problem is in the abuse And when you have people that step outside the law to use that methodology for whatever political personal gain or so on, that's the issue. Those people need to be prosecuted and put in jail. Once that's done, once those laws are enforced, the system will continue forward as it should be used. And that's to protect the United States.
But that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. There's still hope. You voted for the people who voted for FISA 702. The people you put in power are making these decisions. So vote to change it. Hold the people accountable who are responsible for this. Every year, your representatives vote to support these measures. So make them take your privacy and personal security seriously. Not even Donald Trump can be trusted to wield this kind of power. After the dossier against him was released, Trump trashed FISA as overstepping its authority. Then he immediately came out and said it was actually okay and that his team had fixed the problem with FISA and that now it was going to keep Americans safe. What's worse is that in January of 2018, under President Trump's watch, the Senate passed another 6-year extension of the NSA's spying program, allowing the agency to continue collecting texts and emails without a warrant. No one should have this kind of all-seeing power over our lives. Even Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, who helped create the Patriot Act, says that what the government is doing now is well beyond any powers they've been granted. It's like a God complex. The NSA is all-seeing and omniscient. But with omniscience comes omnipotence. If they can see everything, then nothing we say is safe. And they have proven time and again they can't handle this responsibility. Our freedoms can be taken away by force, but, and this is much more dangerous, they can also be taken away simply by our ignorance.
The greatest fear that I have regarding the outcome for America of these disclosures is that nothing will change. People will see in the media all of these disclosures. They'll know the lengths that the government is going to grant themselves powers unilaterally to create greater control over American society and global society. But they won't be willing to take the risks necessarily to stand up and fight to change things, to force their representatives to actually take a stand in their interests.
George Orwell's novel 1984 doesn't have to become the future. But to prevent that, we, as Americans, have to do something about it ourselves. The people we put in power aren't doing it for us, and unless we stand up and take back our rights, our freedoms and privacy will vanish forever. Living comfortably in denial is only too easy, especially when you can't see what's being taken away from you. But even if you can't, someone else can, because in America, someone is always watching.